meeting is now being recorded.
Great. So moving on, it is my pleasure to introduce Corey Fields and Eric Wendell. Corey is a very well-known entertainment and intellectual property lawyer. He's also a legal writer, teacher, and scholar. He practices entertainment, media, copyright, and trademark law for clients around the world and works in a variety of areas of the entertainment industry. In addition, he is a lecturer in law at the USC Gold School of Law. Corey recently published a textbook on entertainment law, which could be a wonderful resource for all of us in going back to learning how to find and secure rights for music. In addition of many areas in which Corey has served on national service organizations, he is also the former president of the Copyright Association for the U.S. Our second speaker is Eric Wendell. Eric is the Director of Rental and Grand Rights at the music publishing house Boosey and Hawkes. Eric brings to us over 17 years of experience as a music industry professional. He is a performer. He has experience in business and administration, history, marketing, education, analytics, journalism, and research. It is a pleasure to have both of you with us today, and I know we are going to learn a lot. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey, who will drive the show for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Hello, everybody. This will be the Corey and Eric show. We want to make this appropriately creative. And I also want to thank Johanna Shebel, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, who has put together the technology for us. I had the great pleasure of being at your two recent Dance USA meetings, and I've gotten to know a lot of you in person. And we will never lose sight in this webinar of the real point, which is dance. And we being lawyers, publishers, we're here to actually serve the dance companies and the composers, get them together. And we're going to keep that in mind as we talk. So that's always the ultimate goal. And by the way, Amy, in your introduction, you didn't mention that in college I was once invited to be the piano player for a dance class. And, after I played and they warmed up and danced, they kind of looked at me and said, maybe you should go to law school. So that I do have a background in music, and I'm always honored to be in contact with people who create beautiful works. For the slides, what we're doing is we're starting at that high level about the approach to music overall, and we'll gradually get more and more granular. As I put this together, in an attempt to be communicative, I thought, well, why don't we sort of, because this is a sort of an educational process about music licensing for those who need it, let's use sort of basic ballet exercises as sort of a point of entry. At which point Amy reminded me that not everybody's from a ballet company. So there you have it. But that's the reason for the meant to be engaging and bring you into the topic ballet bar stretches. So, some of the threshold issues, of course, when you're putting together a work, ideally, this is all idealized. We actually all are, part of the same world of creative works, and very often it's not idealized. It's done in a rush, last minute. People, as we say, fall in love with a particular piece of music, and then to their shock and horror a week before the premiere, discover they, can't afford or can't get the rights. So I think between Eric and I, we're very realistic on the reality. So please forgive us for sort of presenting this sanitized, real ideal version. What do you think, Eric? Are we sanitizing the reality here a little bit?
No, I wouldn't say sanitizing, but we definitely want to inform people as early as possible what the terms and what should be expected when working with music and dance. So, as you had mentioned, Corey, the last thing we want is a week before a premiere, for any presenter, dancer, choreographer, or group to be sidelined with something that may impede their premiere performance. So while this is, I wouldn't say as sanitized as, it's definitely an overview to at least get people hip to what is expected and what the realities can be moving forward.
Okay, great. So Eric and I have already had a big fight. I said it was sanitized. He said it isn't. So this is going to be a really lively presentation, I predict. So one of the sort of threshold issues, there's several on this page, sort of like first steps. Are you going to commission a composer to do a new score, or do you want to use existing music? Will you use live musicians or recording? The third one is a very crucial issue. It is whether you're going to be using music that is free to use because it's in the public domain, or whether it's going to be protected by copyright requiring licensing. And we're going to talk about why and how. What are your options with those parameters? Well, I mean, as a sort of observation, if you commission music, you may be able to get lots of exclusive rights to that score. If you pay for it, you may be able to use it for a year or two or a season or two, and no one else can. You have a lot more flexibility on setting the terms, and obviously, you get to choose the composer and the musical style. It has a downside too. It's going to take a long time because the music hasn't been written yet. And of course, with commissions, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. You can't always count on Petrushka or The Rite of Spring when you commission a composer. Live or recorded, again, if you have live musicians performing, while on the one hand, there's costs for that and payments for that and rehearsals and all kinds of issues. On the other hand, you won't have to go out and get a license from a record label, because you're not using a sound recording. And again, on the public domain front, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So those are the sort of options. And I put at the end here, creative necessity followed by both an exclamation point and a question mark. And this actually, at this beginning of the presentation, is the right time to bring in the phrase that Eric and I are familiar with, and some of you may or may not be familiar with, which is, be careful about falling in love with music before you know you can use it. And, that is a worldwide artistic and creative thing. It happens in films, it happens in television, it happens in live dance, it happens everywhere else. Something is absolutely perfect. It gets the creative juices flowing. It's going to be fantastic production. You're going to sell 1 million tickets, and the business side comes after, as it should, by the way. It absolutely should. Just to make it clear, I am not advocating for you doing a careful analysis before you make a creative decision. Absolutely not. That would be, not the way the arts work or are meant to work. But as Eric said, yeah, go ahead.
And if I may jump in, just because this is something I see quite often, which is a presenter or a company has a fantastic creative idea and wants to use a piece of music, and you bring this to the composer or, the state of the composer, and they may not agree with you. So in concert, what we're saying is, be aware that the copyright owner or the state or composer can say no. They might disagree with what you have to say or what you might be, presenting with your piece. If I may bring in a real-world synopsis that happened to me last week, is that a dance company came to us and wanted to do something with one of our works, and it was a very politically charged work that the composer said no to based off of that. So while it could be provocative and truly creative, the copyright owner or holder can definitely say, I'm not comfortable with this usage, and say no. So as Corey said, don't exactly fall in love with your vision or what you think is you'd like to accomplish, because the reality is the person can say no.
Well, I think I would phrase it more like it's okay to fall in love with a piece of music. But,
sure.
Start dating before you get married. Like, maybe start to investigate.
Perfect.
Wow, this would be so great. Can we, is there a chance we can afford it or get the rights? My personal view is you should definitely fall in love with an artistic concept first, or else your audience will sniff out that it's not everything it should be. But the role of people like Eric and me is to help you.
Precisely.
So I'm going to advance the slide here. Okay, you're all snickering. Thank God I can't hear any of you going, oh, this is lame. Grand plie. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So what is a song? A lot of what we're doing is about terminology. And a song it can be several things. For the purposes of our conversation today, it has to be sort of split up into a couple main components. A song is, in essence, two things. It's the musical composition and lyrics, if it's a sung song. Obviously, if it's simply an instrumental, there's no lyrics or vocals. On the one hand, and that is one copyright. That copyright is about who created it. So if a composer creates a score or a song or writes a song, that's one copyright. When they later go into the recording studio and create a sound recording, that's actually an entirely separate copyright. And many of you are very familiar with this, that you have to get two different types of licenses, one that ultimately goes back to the composer and lyricist, and the other that ultimately goes back to the record label if you're using a recording. So the next slide goes into this in a little more detail. There's, in essence, two copyrights in every song. And again, remember what I said earlier. If you're going to have live performers, then you don't need to worry about the copyright in the sound recording because you're not going to use it. You're going to have live performers performing it. And so there's the musical composition. That's the songwriter. The sound recording is the recording artist or artiste. And the businesses that work with them and represent these rights typically are a music publisher for the composer or songwriter and the record label. And those are the cast of characters that you're going to be dealing with. Au français, I'm fascinated by the fact that, at least in the world of ballet, French seems to be so prominent. And that's kind of a good metaphor, because in music licensing, there's a special language as well. And the overall language, the main ones that may apply here are actually starting at the bottom, grand rights, which I'll explain a little bit, synchronization license, which is the technical term for when you put a musical composition into say a video. Copyright very often uses very archaic terminology. It's like synchronizing sound with images, so sync license for that purpose. A master license is what you call it if you're going to be doing media like this, simply coming from the master recording tape from the old school technology. But for live dance, it's a grand rights license. And let me see what that is on this next slide here. Okay, I'm going to go back and explain this a little bit. And this also goes to when Eric mentioned that a copyright owner can say no to a request to use music for choreography. This is an area where there's a lot of confusion. And here's what I'm getting at. There are a lot of things in the music industry and in music licensing that are automatic and compulsory. And at some level, many people are familiar with that. It's like, okay, if I have a concert hall or if I have a radio station or a TV station, I go to Ascap and I go to BMI and I pay them a fee once a year. It's called a blanket license, and it covers all of the music they represent. And it's a very good and very efficient, and it's sort of an automatic thing because let's say you are a concert hall or a radio station. You take out these licenses, play whatever you want to play. You don't have to say, may I play the Beatles today? Can I play Bob Dylan tomorrow? What about Lady Gaga? You don't have to do that. You just go ahead and play it. And there's also another area in the music industry where it is largely automatic and compulsory. You may have heard of the term mechanical licenses. That have to do with making recordings of songs. All of those systems in the music industry are sort of large-scale, industry-wide, sort of automated. And with grand rights, it's not automated. Grand rights, as we'll discuss a little more, is the term that's used for theatrical use of music. And let me see if this is now on the next slide. Okay, we're going to get there. But in essence, the owners of music let some of their rights be used in this sort of grand, industry-wide, automatic, blanket licensing scheme. And then there's other situations where they can say yes or no, they can set the price, and that's what applies to the theater. Historically, the music industry has always had the philosophy that once you use a musical work in a theatrical, dramatic context of some kind, and that does include ballet and choreography, it has more value. You don't let that right be part of the sort of mass industry-wide blanket licensing. When it comes to a theatrical use, it's a very special amalgamation of the music and a dramatic concept, and it's presented to an audience that will come and pay a higher ticket premium. This is, the traditional view. We certainly understand the different economic models in the dance world, I assure you. But that is the historical reason and the current reason why you are, unfortunately, as choreographers and dance companies, not in that automated licensing category. Because you want to take the music and give it a new life in a dramatic context in a new way that will attract the interest of audiences in a way that kind of goes far beyond, for example, just hearing a song on a radio. So,
and Corey, if I can add to that's for works that have a very specific almost storyline as well, like the Rite of Spring and Appalachian Spring are two good examples of something that have a very linear storyline. But that could also be for something that is seen in the abstract or something like that as well. Obviously, anything, as you mentioned, that evokes a sense of drama, including, staging, costuming, movement, visual cues, and things like that would certainly fall under grand rights.
Yeah, I think if it's helpful, and maybe we'll get some questions on the public chat on this, if you go to a concert hall and hear, a symphonic work or a chamber work performed, you're there for the music. They are playing music and you are listening. There are no additional dramatic elements. It's not a theatrical experience. And I'm very glad Eric made that point because, there can be situations, admittedly, where it's not clear if it's a theatrical experience or not. So I think for today's purposes, we are assuming that this is a more or less, I want to take this music and tell a story in dance language type of scenario. And if you're all looking for some cool loophole, like, maybe it's not much of a story, I'm sorry, I can't offer you much of a loophole, but let's carry on. So how do you start to even, let's say you've now gotten to the point where you do want to tell a story or dramatize or have a theatrical presentation with dancers and music, and you're within this grand rights. By the way, the opposite, the doppelganger for grand rights is called small rights. And the other way to terminology, now that we're talking about music terminology, is often very simple, dramatic or non-dramatic. And, as music rights holders, those are sort of the key words. Is it non-dramatic? Is it dramatic? Is it a small right or a grand right? That's the sort of lingo. So how do you start? Let's say you've now made your decision. You have fallen in love with some music, and you do want to tell the story using the language of dance. And you do want to know if it's going to be realistic, and you want to know as soon as possible so that you can either, fall in love with a different piece or whatever you need to do on the business side. So, who are the copyright owners? And this goes right back to the question about public domain. Yes, are you safe with Mozart? Yeah, probably. Just without getting into the weeds and really, having you roll your eyes. And I suspect that everybody now is rolling their eyes when I even suggest for a moment that Mozart might not be public domain. I'll just tell you that if I take a Mozart work and arrange it myself for, pick your instrumentation, I actually have a copyright in my arrangement of that public domain work. So if you're going to use the Corey Field arrangement of a Mozart symphony, there's a copyright there. It's not in the Mozart, it's in the arranging. So, there are these nuances. But so everything
Corey,
is really quite simple. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just want to say that is an amazing distinction to make. There's many times when people ask me if something is under copyright or not, or if they have to sort of do any research as to figure out if it is, I always respond with, first and foremost, is it yours? And the answer is no. Most likely you have to seek some sort of permission. Like you said, if it's Mozart, just, it's flat out Mozart, you're safe. Like you said, but if it's the Corey Field arrangement, even though it's of a public domain piece, they will have to get permission from you to perform the work. And so that's a very, very keen distinction that I think is, worth knowing. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Right, and by the way, I am seeing the questions come in, and these are exactly the questions I get in person when I have the privilege of meeting with you all. It's like, hey, we did all this and haven't heard back yet, so we're going to address that for sure, the best we can, right? And by the way, this, maybe I should just interject here that part of the, it is a harsh reality when you really want to use some music. Maybe we should expand the range of professional obstacles from, yes or no, cost and price, and then maybe add a third element, which is sheer, professional workability. At some level, if someone doesn't respond, that's actually another obstacle, and a horrible one, and the worst of all, I think, when you do what you are supposed to do and you don't hear back. We'll talk more about that. It's a great question and an incredibly common question. So thank you, Claire Florian, for posing that one. And also thank you to Melinda Bloom for asking a similar question. Eric and I will give it our best shot later, but I think it's fair to say there's a third element. It's whether the darn rights holder is professional and gets back to you. And I'm not sure we have a solution to that, but maybe it's, part of your toolkit of, okay, yet a third element here to deal with. The copyright owners, I was about to say it's very simple. When it comes to licensing a work that's under copyright, you need to talk to the copyright owner. It's as simple as that, but it's also very confusing sometimes because, as we'll see, there are sometimes more than one copyright owner. And sometimes they can be difficult to locate. Eric reminded us all of Worldcat.org as an online website where you can look up musical works. And Eric, do you want to give us a brief description of that experience of trying to find who owns the copyright in a work? Which, remember, is different from saying, okay, it's a song recorded by Lady Gaga. We need to know who owns the recording, who owns the songwriting, so we can contact them. Do you want to tell us a bit about Worldcat.org?
I'd love to. So what Worldcat.org is, it's a website that was built out from a group called OCLC, which is the Online Computer Library Center, which is a nonprofit within the library and information science realm. And what it is if you're especially looking for recorded music or sheet music, you do a general like free text search of any particular work, such as Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, and things like that. And through the search functionality, you can see who publishes the work, and that will at least give you a lead as to where to go. So, for example, if you were to search for John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine, which is a concert work that Boosey and Hawkes represents, you can search, if you're not sure that Boosey and Hawkes represents this work, you can search for that piece of music, filter on the sheet music portion, and it'll show you under the publisher Boosey and Hawkes. So now you know at least I have to contact Boosey regarding next steps and things like that. So it's a very powerful research tool that I know a lot of music librarians that I work with on a daily basis use as a means to finding works for their upcoming programming. In addition to it, not only for concert works, but for any real musical work. And then I mentioned sheet music. We can also go to record labels and things like that if you want specific recordings. So it's a powerful tool that I highly recommend for everyone, especially if you're starting at, square one with trying to find who's the copyright owner for a particular work.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, the next couple slides will show you exactly how to do this searching on Ascap and BMI. If you remember, a couple minutes ago, I said that there's this industry-wide blanket licensing for concert halls and radio stations and bars and nightclubs and television stations, and that's for non-dramatic music use. And the two largest organizations that do that in the United States are Ascap, American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, and Broadcast Music Incorporated.com, BMI. And, ironically, you could easily go through your entire life as a dance company and choreographer and never deal with them because you're always doing grand rights and you have to go direct to the publisher and you're not interested in blanket licenses. But their website is very useful to look up songs that are listed there, and it tells you who the copyright owners are and the publishers. For record labels, there's allmusic.com, which is another resource. I'm going to go forward to an example of doing some searching. So my attempt to connect with all of you was to search for the song Dancing in the Street. And I went on Ascap. And by the way, I kind of lucked out. Ascap turns out to have been, of the two, Ascap or BMI, the one that had it listed. But if I didn't find it there, I would simply have gone to BMI.com and done the search there. So interesting, song titles aren't copyrighted usually. I searched for the song Dancing in the Street, and I got 12 different songs. It's going to be a little difficult for you to see this screenshot that I threw on the PowerPoint. This is the first screen I found. It's like, oh my gosh, there's 12 of them. And the next screen, I figured out, I happen to know who wrote the famous version. I'm very proud to say I actually have represented Nikki Stevenson, one of the writers of Dancing in the Street. And so I figured out which of the 12 is that one. And then on the right here, it says publishers. And that's code for copyright owners, okay? And this screen is exactly why everyone hates music licensing, because there's 3 writers and 4 publishers. And, right away it's like, oh my God, it's like, really? I have to contact 4 separate companies for this one song. And unfortunately, that's, by the way, not always the case. Joni Mitchell, she writes her own songs. There'd be one publisher and one songwriter. I'm a big Joni Mitchell fan. Go ahead and use Joni Mitchell. That would be great. I'll come to your ballet. But this is an example of how to find the information. And what I did was, if you notice on the right under the publisher column, it says contact info and a little down arrow, and you click on that, and there it is. So I know that, for each of these publishers, I'm going to click, I'm going to see, okay, this one happens to be Joe Bet Music, care of Sony. This is very common in the music world, by the way. There's the copyright owner, publisher, whether it's Joe Bet or whatever it is, very often their rights are administered by a much larger company like Sony. So it's very common to see this type of thing. There's a phone number. Here there's no email. Very often there actually is an email. And so what I would be doing is I'd be writing down the names of the 4 publishers. And by the way, I would be looking for any overlap. Like, I wouldn't be surprised here. I didn't click on the other publishers. Wouldn't surprise me for a second if some of these other publishers, FCG or MG III, if they're also represented by Sony. And at that point, I know, okay, if I go to Sony, I'm talking to the representative of 3 of the 4 publishers. So that's kind of, how you get the information. And this is interesting. Through Amy and Dance USA, I was told that the record label Naxos, now we're on by the way, do you remember I said there's 2 copyrights in every song? So we were just looking at the songwriting copyright. And now on this page, we're looking at the sound recording side. It happens to be a different recording, but there's a record label named Naxos, which over the decades has emerged as a major player in the world of, classical music with some jazz and other aspects. And they have started a website with automatic sound recording licensing. I spoke to them. They're preparing an FAQ, and you'll probably be hearing more about it. But again, this could be a good tool. Like, let's say you did need a, Beethoven's 7th Symphony Adagio recording to dance to. You can actually enter the information here. And you can see on this particular track, which I'm not familiar with, but they directed me to it because this is pre-cleared. And I basically, by doing the usual online thing of a few clicks like live event, 5 or more performances worldwide, the price is $400. There it is. I don't know if you can see it, but anything that makes your life easier is good. So all things being equal, if you think you might need a sound recording, any record label, Naxos included, that makes it this easy is a good thing. And also they claim that they're available for phone calls and questions. And again, that goes to some of your questions about people getting back to you. And by the way, I'm seeing great questions roll in just to highlight, what if the information on Ascap is incorrect? What about, here's a really long one. What is this one? How do small companies advocate to get help? And I have some ideas on that. We'll talk about that. Okay, I'm jumping ahead to the questions, but I'm delighted to see them. Thank you. I don't know, Amy, can all the participants see the public chat? Is everybody seeing these questions I'm seeing?
Yes, Corey, everybody can see the questions.
Okay,
yes,
great.
during the Q&A, once you get through your slides, we'll be able to address those questions.
Yeah, and I'm now going to move ahead quickly. I realize we need to leave lots of time to address the question. Okay, so here's some of the stuff we've covered. Grand rights versus small rights. In essence, non-dramatic versus dramatic. Choreography in the dramatic category. These are freely negotiated licenses. How do they figure out the terms if it's freely negotiated? The slide here says often based on their own history. A publisher like Boosey and Hawkes has been doing this for 100 years, and they have a history of what various companies around the world are licensing their works for. I've already mentioned the value of the theater in the mind of the music licensor. And sound recording public performance rights. I'm going to not get too nerdy here. You heard I've got a book. I teach at a law school. Sound recording, you know what? I'm going to just hold on that topic because I'll just confuse everybody. I couldn't resist listing it. I think for purposes of our conversation today, if you're going to take a sound recording, put it on your own computer, hit play when the piece you're going to need, a license from the copyright owner. So I'm not going to get you too confused. A couple things about negotiating. Eric, jump in any time here. Just, again, more sort of like terminology you're going to come up against. MFN, most favored nations. So in a sort of classic, go ahead, Eric, why don't you talk about MFN?
Oh, sure. With most favored nations, what we generally do is if it's not uncommon for dance companies to create pieces of music that encompass, maybe 5-minute excerpts from a work that Boosey and Hawks has, a 5-minute excerpt from something from a different publisher, and things like that. So what we try to do in those situations is take a most favored nations approach and sort of try to get to a deal where everything's been negotiated and each of the publishers sort of agrees with all the terms and all of the pricing and things like that, so that way the project can move forward and things like that. Because first and foremost, like Corey said at the beginning of the presentation, is we want to make sure that the work that you all are doing comes to fruition. So we really do try to work as best we can with other publishers as things like that come into play.
Yeah, I think MFN, you mentioned, Eric, a work with several different compositions. In essence, all the publishers want to get the same payment. If it's, equal quantity, 5 minutes from each publisher, they want to be sure that they're not taking less than the other copyright owner. And this also comes into play in licensing between remember, the two sides of every song, the music composition side with the publisher and the sound recording side with the record label. MFN is totally common there because in theory, you're talking to two entirely separate companies, possibly on different sides of the planet, and they don't know the deal you're making with the other copyright owner. And they each will say, okay, I want, say, $1,000 MFN, meaning you can't pay. If I'm the record label and Eric's the publisher, then I'm going to say, okay, you can use my sound recording for $1,000 MFN. And what I'm really telling you is you can't pay Eric more than $1,000. If you decide to pay Eric $2,000, then I get $2,000. Now, what that means is when you're negotiating licenses for more than one copyright owner, maybe more than one publisher, or a publisher versus a sound recording record label copyright owner, you need to herd the cats is the best way I can describe it, meaning, have the big picture, decide how much you have to pay if you can, and tell everybody, okay, instead of me going back and forth, and you want 1,000, and you want 2, and you want 1,500, and then I have to do this 8 times, I'm going to give you all MFN, you all get X thousand, that's what's in our budget, what do you say? And I have found, as a strategic matter, if you have a budget and it's, reasonably within everyone's historical parameters for the type of production, and you just say, this is what we can do, everyone gets the same, you will save yourself a lot of negotiation time. And I wonder if my slide with the cats is coming up here. I'll come back. Don't worry. Here it is. So herding cats. These are my cats. And you'll notice that they are very cooperatively in line, doing exactly what I want them to do because I'm giving them something they want. It's mealtime. I suggest all of you treat publishers and record labels exactly like I treat my cats, meaning that if you really want the deal to go through, try and figure out where they're coming from. If it's a really popular song, they're going to want more money, and you may realistically need to do that. If it's, something that's not used very often and it's sort of found money for them, make that argument. But the cats align when you give them something they want. And I didn't get a license from my cats to use their photos, so after this call, we'll have to see how that plays out at home. So what are some of the other concepts in the licensing?
Corey,
Gross
this
box
is Amy.
office
I'd like
receipt.
to jump in real quick because I think right off of those, your comments about dealing with the publishers is a great point to just address the questions. A couple of them have come in specifically around what do you do when you've tried and tried and tried and tried and are not getting any responses from the publishing house. And I don't know if, Eric, you have any thoughts on this. And then secondly, there's a question, a couple of comments and questions around due diligence. Can you use the music if you've tried for a year to get a hold of the copyright owners and you are just getting no response? So just focusing on those two questions, what would your answers be?
I could
Eric, do you want to lead it off on that?
Yeah, most certainly. First and foremost, if you don't hear from a publisher or anything like that, I would definitely say keep at them and also understand that that's incredibly unprofessional, in my opinion. And also, if you don't hear from them, it might be something, in the details and something like that. Perhaps you're asking for a piece of music and you're waiting for the copyright owner or the composer to sign off on it. And they might be delaying in some or for whatever reason, or may not be accessible. But if you don't hear from after repeated inquiries, and Ms. Bloom, this is regarding your question, I would definitely say, and Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, if an agreement isn't met, you really can't move forward with performing the music or anything like that. Corey, is that a safe assumption, legally speaking?
Yeah, the letter, the basic premise is when you use someone else's copyright and don't have permission, you're a copyright infringer. I can't put it any more simple than that. If there were a loophole of I tried really hard and professionally, never heard from you, now I get to go ahead, then here's the deal. You'd all know about it. It would be the greatest thing ever invented. We wouldn't even be having this webinar. Everyone would ask for a license and either get it or wait the year and then go ahead anyway. So I just can't offer that. Part of that conversation, is about risk and stuff like that. And I'll give you a couple perspectives on this. There's two questions here. One is not getting a response. I didn't mention that I was, in fact, before I went to law school, I was Eric. I was a music publisher. Eric, I'm you before you go to law school. If you go to law school, you'll be me. So I was actually the person doing, I don't know. Well, we'll have to ask our audience if it's fantastic or not. But my experience was that the people who do this licensing have a huge workload. And when something comes in that looks like it's, from their perspective, a home run, it's like, oh my gosh, Mercedes-Benz wants Stravinsky in an international car ad and they're offering $1 million. I guarantee you there's going to be very quick action on that. But then when someone says, hey, we're a not-for-profit, we have no budget, but we need this work, human nature is that they may not jump on that request. They may say, no, let me deal with the Mercedes-Benz ad first. And I think realistically, and I don't have a solution for this, this is sort of like commiserating. I think in the nonprofit arts world, which I am very active in, I have a sort of unusual niche practice with a lot of classical music arts organizations. The nonprofit world is at a little bit of a disadvantage from the start because it's not usually contacting rights holders with an open checkbook. And I don't think I have a solution for that. I think that may lie behind some of the delays sometimes, not always. I don't mean to paint a kind of a weird picture. I think with a company like Boosey, I don't think it's that big a factor. I think with Sony Publishing, who literally has the Beatles, I think it might be a factor just on sheer, workload. I think, what we said earlier really applies. It's like when you make an approach and you do it professionally and you get in touch and you don't hear back, that's actually another factor in the process that I don't actually have an easy solution to. The other solutions that are not as easy, for my clients, on a really good day, I personally know the licensing person, and I call them and I say, look, you've got to look in your inbox. You've got to find my client's email, and you've got to look at it because we got to get an answer here. And yeah, can that work? That does work occasionally, but not always. There's also, I've mentioned this at Dance USA meetings, there are people who are not lawyers who are professional licensing people. And to me, the great advantage of using them, if they're affordable, and I heard one person say they weren't that cheap, okay, but is they do this 24/7, and the people with the very full email inbox know them. They're going to open that email from Deborah because they get emails from her all the time and do deals with her all the time. So, that I always offer that as a potential solution. I've heard that that's expensive, but that's actually a different problem. The expense of licensing, the expense of getting a license, the expense of maybe hiring a licensing person, maybe even hiring a lawyer. I don't have a magic answer to that. And that ties in a little bit to one of the questions, which is, can Dance USA do anything about this? Amy, far be it from me to start suggesting that you could, but I don't know if there's an information exchange of publishers who are quick to respond. Maybe, something like that. I don't know. A lot of these licenses are subject to confidentiality, so I'm not sure how much information you could sort of put out there for your members.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, you and I can chat after this about Laura's specific question about what the broader advocacy could be with Dance USA to help fix this. With the note that we do have just a couple minutes left, and this is a 101 in trying to get basic information out on how to find and navigate music rights. I was wondering, Corey, if there were any final comments, or Eric, any final comments you wanted to make based on the terms and other slides that you had put together here.
Yeah, I can definitely jump on in.
Point out. Oh, go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
Oh, sure.
Please, go ahead.
I will say that when you do reach out to a publisher, have as much information that Corey has laid out on this particular slide, because the more information we have, the more we have to work with. That's also, I would actually add a little bit more to this. If you have the CV of the choreographer, the storyline or the synopsis of the work itself and things like that, that's something that composers like to look at as well, because they want to see at least perhaps an example of how their music will be worked into this choreographer's particular, vision, things like that. And obviously, too, as far in advance as possible, just in case, composers on some tight deadlines doesn't have time, or they might be traveling, things like that, or, particular states that, just take their time with inquiries and things like that. The earlier, the better, and that's something I can't stress enough.
I see a really nice comment from Laird Rodet. Says, have a good relationship with the creators of the music and the sound recording. They can open the doors for you. That's always really good advice, and it kind of goes into the general thing we started with, which is, I guarantee you the Beatles will be more expensive than an up-and-coming young local songwriter who might be thrilled to work with you. They might even own all their own rights. So strategically, that goes right back to the beginning of what music are you in love with and want to present. If you can have a good match, so to speak, between, something that will be a wonderful production and, someone who is still maybe an emerging artist or something like that, that is a really good approach. Happy to leave time for any more questions if there is more time.
Thank you. Yes, we are at the top of the hour. I am willing to go to 3:05 Eastern Time. Those of you that need to step off, please remember that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Dance USA website in the next day or two, so it will be available for free for you to download and listen to. We did get a question in from Beth. She writes, is there a standard amount per song per performance that one can expect for grand rights license?
Okay, Eric, over to you on that.
Sure. Well, first off, in terms of how things are priced, you have to sort of take it a more granular approach. So first and foremost, in the classical music world, something that's obviously only 6 minutes long is going to be less than something that's 35 minutes long. Additionally, is it for full orchestra or is it for, a chamber piece or a small amount of works? If you're doing, in my experience, I always try to price things out if it's for the same, if it's 5 minutes for an orchestral piece and it's all the same terms for the same performances, then I actually try to round it all up and try to get something smaller because you're doing so many songs and things like that. But each song, and also depends to if, one of the songs is, only a solo piece and another song is a full, symphonic work and things like that. But we always try to do a standard amount per song, so long as the song and is, more or less in scope with the other songs and things like that.
There you have it.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. We do have a lot of wonderful questions on here. I think that we were able to answer a lot of them. Johanna and I will go through them and pull out the ones we were not able to address directly and send you guys email responses. So we will make sure that you hear back from us. With that, we can start to wrap up. Oh, I did just see one last question come in from Catherine. What determines fair use for educational purposes? And that will be our final question for today.
Well, thanks for the hardest question of the hour with 2 minutes to go. So fair use is in the eye of the beholder, and fair use ultimately is decided by judges in court cases. So someone like me can, talk about the parameters of what fair use is, but there's no like fair use guarantee much of the time. And even then it's like, okay, I guess if you were in a court case, I think this would be a fair use, but there's no sort of like magic, square peg and square hole, this is a fair use. Education, while there are certain, parameters for using snippets of things in education, like let's say I'm teaching, a history of pop song course, it's probably a fair use for me to have little snippets of pop songs in the course to illustrate an educational thing. When you're doing a full performance, the fact that it's in a university, for example, doesn't really mean it's like an educational event. It happens to be a performance in a university. If your question is, what if we are doing a residency and we're doing a minute from a ballet to demonstrate something but not the whole ballet, I personally think that sounds like a fair use to me. It's all about the context, how much you're using. There's a 4-factor legal test, which I need hardly tell you is a feast for lawyers. Oh boy, a 4-factor test, full employment for life. So it's very dependent on the circumstances. And, this is why people hire lawyers to do an analysis and give them a risk assessment of whether it's a fair use or not.
And if I can jump in on that one as well, for me personally, when people talk about fair use, I think Corey kind of touched upon it, that it's always a little bit of a murky gray area. And I would say, first and foremost, due diligence and at least ask the publisher. So at least you can even sort of say that, they said yes or no, that kind of thing. So the very last thing you want is someone deciding for you whether or not what you thought was fair use is or is not. So that way you can at least sort of say, well, I went to the publisher and they said it's okay. Or I went to the publisher and they said no, and things like that. Just get their, obviously their yes or no or anything like that, so that you don't end up, in court over something, or it gets murky, or, more headaches erupt because of it. So that's my
the message is it's case by case. Yeah, it's an almost impossible question to answer in a sort of like global educational performances. Is it fair to use? It's very fact dependent.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much, Corey. You guys have been wonderful speakers. You have tremendous amounts of information, and clearly we could dive deeper and deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole of navigating music rights for dance. So thank you for sharing your time. It's very helpful to us, and I look forward to future conversations with you. And thank you to everyone who took time out of your busy day to join our webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, you're welcome.